Developing the presidential powers as chief administrator, Polk signed the Independent Treasury Act into law on August 1846. It created what was called the Independent Treasury System, which separated public funds from the banking system. All money paid to or from the federal government had to be made in special treasury notes and retained in the national treasury or one of the several sub-treasuries. This system was designed to prevent the reckless speculation that had led to the economic disaster of 1837. The act was never fully implemented and was eventually replaced when an act of Congress voted to close the sub-treasuries in 1920. For better or for worse, Polk's legacy will forever be tied to what his opponents vehemently called Mr. Polk's War. 1,773 Americans were killed in battle. Far more, 13,271, were killed by disease. Mexican casualties in battle are estimated to be upwards of 25,000. On February 3, 1845, Polk issued orders for an American force under General Zachary Taylor to march into the territory disputed between Texas, the newest addition to the American Union, and the nation of Mexico, and erect a fort there. Polk ordered Taylor to blockade the mouth of the Rio Grande River in an action that most historians view as an attempt designed to provoke the Mexican government into firing the first shots of a war. The first shots would indeed be fired when an American patrol under a Lieutenant Thornton was attacked and then captured by Mexican forces. Days later, the same Mexican forces assaulted Taylor's earthen fort and were repulsed. Taylor counterattacked and devastated the Mexican army at Palo Alto, and then again at Resaca de la Palma, and then for a third time at the Matamoros. Days before news of the battle along the Rio Grande, Polk had told his cabinet that they had ample cause for war, for an insult to the American ambassador and the previous destruction of American property during Mexico's internal struggles. Now, with news of the Thornton affair and the attack on Taylor's forces, the American public was outraged. Polk sent an official message to Congress on May 11, 1846, asking for and justifying a declaration of war. Many in Congress claimed that Polk's ordering of Taylor into the region had actually begun the war, and that he had committed an unconstitutional act in doing so. The country's two main political parties were split on the issue along partisan lines. Polk's Democratic allies eventually won out, with the argument that the United States has the duty to support its troops already deployed. The American public, fuming at the Mexican assault on Taylor's fort and the Thornton affair, agreed. The declaration of war passed. War fever spread across the nation. So many Americans volunteered, many would never even have the opportunity to see action. President Polk, as Commander-in-Chief, took an active interest in the management of America's armies. His highest-ranking generals, Winfield Scott and Zachary Taylor, were both prominent Whigs with political aspirations. As Taylor won victory after victory on the Texas-Mexican border, his popularity began to eclipse that of the president himself. He would indeed be elected as Polk's successor to the office in 1848. Taylor wrote that the president would on occasion deprive him of supplies because of personal jealousy and political intrigue. Winfield Scott, by far the most experienced of American military officers, was initially refused the field appointment by Polk and would remain at his desk in Washington for much of the conflict's first year. Taking the Mexican territory of California was far from a difficult task and was perhaps the most easily achieved of Polk's four great measures. Before the beginning of the Mexican-American War, California had already witnessed a series of pro-American rebellions. On June 4, 1846, just weeks after Palo Alto, immigrants from the United States seized the Mexican governor, beginning what is now known as the Bear Flag Rebellion, and a few days later declared an independent Republic of California. U.S. Consul Thomas Larkin, previously dispatched on a mission by Polk to bring about such a rebellion in California, went and persuaded Admiral John Sloat, commander of the American Pacific Squadron, who had not yet heard of the declaration of war, to seize the city of Monterey with his 250 Marines. So then marched north to seize San Francisco. California became part of the United States. The majority of the Californios soon accepted American rule, but a minority would fight against the Americans for the following decades. The successes of America's superior armed forces could not be contained. In August of 1846, Polk wrote to General Taylor that a peace must be conquered in the shortest space of time possible. Congressional Whigs cried that Polk didn't want peace with Mexico, he wanted a piece of Mexico. Regardless, Taylor attacked and captured the Mexican city of Monterey, while Polk sent envoys to exiled Mexican dictator Santa Anna in an attempt to persuade the Mexican people to come to the negotiating table. Santa Anna would instead return to Mexico to become its warrior president. Polk was in some ways fighting a war on two fronts. Growing anti-war fever had led to a Whig majority in the Senate, inhibiting Polk's ability to push his will through Congress. The opposition in the Capitol was perhaps stronger than the one on the battlefield. Taylor's successes culminated in an American victory after 2 days of struggle at Buena Vista, where he tore apart the Mexican army with the brutally efficiency of the American artillery. In the spring of 1847, General Scott was finally given an army to command. In an ambitious act of tactical brilliance, he decided to land his forces at Veracruz and march on Mexico City from the east, as Polk threatened the Mexican capital from the north. Scott's army captured the port of Veracruz and then scored a succession of American victories at Cerrogorto, Contreras, and Molina del Rey. Scott's forces pierced the defenses of Mexico City itself in the costly battles of Churubusco. Scott's forces scored a coup de grace in the capture of Chapultepec Castle in a fierce battle that waged from sunrise on September 12th to just after 9 on the morning of September 13th. That very night, September 13th, 1847, Mexico's military and political elite, including Santa Anna, met and decided that surrender was their only option. The war was over. Polk was in one of the best negotiating positions in history. He had the Mexican officials at almost literal gunpoint. Polk sent Nicholas Trist, a vehemently pro-slavery former envoy to Cuba, to represent the United States in the negotiations. The Mexican-American War would officially end on February 2nd, 1848, with the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Mexico ceded what is now the states of California, Utah, Nevada, and the majority of Arizona, New Mexico, Wyoming, and Colorado, for the lump sum of $15 million. A provision insisted that Mexico also relinquish all claims to Texas north of the Rio Grande. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo established the Mexican-American border, which has still been altered several times, mostly in the following decade. Mexico had lost 55% of its 1835 land area in just 13 years. New England Whigs, led by Daniel Webster, had opposed the treaty just as they'd opposed the war. Their opposition, however, was not enough to prevent the Southern Democrat-dominated Senate from ratifying the treaty with a two-thirds majority. I imagine that Mr. Polk was smiling broadly in between his bouts of illness. He had added nearly the entirety of the modern American West to the Union. Mr. Polk's war achieved far from universal support. Northern Whigs, including Daniel Webster, considered the war the spilling of American blood and a cause of oppression. Joshua Giddings perhaps best phrased the opposition's opinion. This war is waged against an unoffending people, without just or adequate cause for the purpose of conquest, with a design to extend slavery in violation of the Constitution. I will not bathe my hands in the blood of the people of Mexico. Still, the declaration of war had passed through Congress. Whigs, providing a precedent for those Democrats opposed to the Iraq War of the last decade, voted for the appropriation bills to support the honor of the country and the army. Some of the great icons of the coming era of internal unrest would denounce the war. Ulysses S. Grant, former future Civil War general and U.S. president, who himself served with distinction in the conflict, would say that he was bitterly opposed to the war. Whig and future President Abraham Lincoln gave several speeches condemning the war and once wrote in a letter that Polk's actions places our president where kings have always stood, by involving and impoverishing the American people in an unjust cause.